Welcome to the Untold Affairs. Before we dive into today's story, we have a humble request. Please consider subscribing to this new channel. Help us hit our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Your support will motivate us to keep bringing you more exclusive original cheating wife stories. And now let's get started with today's story. Andy Gilmore stopped his old Ford truck in the driveway and, taking a deep breath, pulled his tired body out of the seat. His hands and clothes were stained with the dust of work, and the deep marks of hard work were clearly visible on his face. Andy, 36, was a strong, hard-working man who put all his youth and energy into building a better life. As soon as he reached the door of the house, he heard a faint laugh and the clatter of teacups from inside. His wife, Claire, and 14-year-old daughter, April, were sitting in the living room watching a show. This scene always soothed Andy's heart. As soon as she opened the door, April shouted with joy, "Daddy, here you are!" and ran to hug him. Andy hugged his daughter and said with a smile, "How was school today, son?" April replied with a chirp, "Very good, Daddy." Andy looked at Claire, who was sitting on the couch smiling, but there was a strange uneasiness in her eyes. Claire had her phone in her hand, and as soon as she saw Andy, she slipped the phone under the pillow. Andy notices this little gesture but says nothing. She calmed herself down by saying that she might be talking to a friend. While the three of them were sitting in the living room after dinner, Andy noticed that Claire was repeatedly checking her phone. His fingers were moving rapidly across the screen, and when Andy's eyes fell on her, he turned the phone off immediately. Andy said with a slight laugh, "Looks like you're talking to someone urgently, Claire." Claire replied flusterically, "No, nothing special. I was just talking to an old friend." Andy smiled, but a slight suspicion crept into his mind. Over the next few weeks, Andy noticed even more changes in Claire's behavior. She would stay on the phone late into the night, take the phone to the washroom, and sometimes switch off the phone immediately when Andy would suddenly come into the room. One night, Andy asked, "Claire, are you hiding something from me?" I'm talking to some old friends." Andy asked no more questions, but the seed of doubt was deeply rooted in his heart. One day, Andy had to return home early from work. Seeing Tom's car in the driveway, his heart started beating loudly. Tom was Andy's childhood best friend who always supported him in his joys and sorrows. But seeing his car today, Andy felt strange. He slowly opened the door and stepped inside. In the living room sat Claire and Tom. There was a slight nervousness on Claire's face, and Tom looked down with his eyes averted. Andy asked in a deep voice, "You two here right now?" Claire said quickly, "Andy, we have to talk." Restlessness began to grow inside Andy. Claire's voice trembled. "Andy, me. I'm sorry. I've betrayed you." There was silence in the room. Andy looked up at Tom, whose eyes were still fixed on the ground. "Is that true, Tom?" Tom nodded softly. Andy's fists clenched, but he held himself. His eyes were red with anger and pain. Have you two done this behind my back?" Claire bowed her head and said softly, "Yes, Andy. I am sorry." It was as if something broke inside Andy. He quietly left the room and sat in his truck. He started the engine and drove to a deserted road outside the city. Tears were flowing from her eyes, and her breathing was getting faster. He stopped the car and rested his head on the steering wheel. "I loved you so much, Claire." "And you did it?" he muttered. The next day, Andy decided he was going to take a DNA test. He took some samples and submitted them to the testing lab. It took a few days for the report to come, but when the report came in his hands, his heart stopped. The report clearly read, "There is a 99.9% probability that April is not Andy Gilmore's biological child." The ground slipped under Andy's feet. April's innocent face began to move before his eyes. "No, that can't be true." That night, when Claire returned home, Andy stood in front of her with the report. Claire's eyes fell on the report, and she burst into tears. "I was afraid to tell you the truth, Andy. I know I've made a big mistake." Andy took a deep breath and said, "You've cheated on not just me, but our daughter as well." Andy decided to leave the house. Hugging April, he said, "Son, I love you so much, but I can't stay here anymore." Tears began to flow from April's eyes. She hugged her father tightly. Andy saw the house for the last time, in which he had spent his entire life, and then headed out somewhere away in the darkness. Andy stopped his Ford truck in the parking lot of a small hotel. The darkness of the night had spread all around, and light rain had brightened the road. His eyes were red, his face tired, and his mind completely empty. She went to the hotel reception and booked a small room. As soon as he closed the door, he fell on the bed and tears started flowing from his eyes as he stared at the ceiling. He could not believe that his marriage, his relationship, his faith, everything had been shattered in one fell swoop. Claire's face, Tom's drooping gaze, and those words from the DNA report, all these were spinning in his mind. After turning and turning throughout the night, the first light of the morning finally came in through the window of the room. Andy washed his face with water and looked at himself in the mirror. "Am I so bad that the people I loved the most betrayed me?" she asked herself. But he had no answer. He got out of the room and went to the small cafe of the hotel and sat down. As soon as he took the first sip of coffee, he pulled out his phone and called the lawyer. "I want a divorce, as soon as possible, and I will fight for custody of my daughter." Andy's voice was cold and firm. The lawyer called to meet him, and Andy headed back to town. On the way, April's face kept coming to his mind. Does she know? Does he know I'm not his biological father? Sitting in the lawyer's office, Andy told the whole story. The lawyer took a deep breath and said, "You have a case, Andy. But it won't be easy. The court usually prioritizes the mother, and you have a DNA test, but the court will also see that in the best interest of the child." Andy nodded and said, "I'm going to fight for my daughter, no matter what happens." Over the next few weeks, the divorce process began. Claire and Tom filed a response on their behalf. In the court documents, Claire wrote that she did not want Andy away from April, but that April's life must remain stable, and for that she must live with her mother. These words pierced deeply for Andy. "You've already broken everything, Claire. Now you call it stability." Meanwhile, April tried to call Andy several times, but Andy did not answer calls. He knew that if she talked to him, he would break down. He loved his daughter, even though the DNA test says otherwise. The court date has finally arrived. Andy and Claire stood face to face. Andy's attorney was arguing on his behalf, and Claire's attorney was trying to prove that April should live with her mother. The court summoned April to testify. When April stood up to testify, there was worry and fear on her face. She said in a trembling voice, "I love my dad very much. He has always cared about me. I can't leave my mom either. I want everything to be the same as before." Tears welled up in Andy's eyes. It was the first time she had seen her daughter break down so much. The court ruled that April would have to live with Claire, but Andy would get the right to visit regularly. As she left the court, Claire looked at Andy and said, "I'm sorry, Andy. What I did is unforgivable." Andy didn't answer. He looked at Claire and then slowly walked away. April was standing outside. She ran and hugged Andy. "Daddy, please don't leave me. I love you so much." Andy hugged his daughter tightly and said, "I will never leave you, son. But I still need some time." That day, Andy decided to leave town. He put all his belongings in the truck and drove out of town without informing anyone. He traveled a few states and finally stopped in a small town. There, he rented a small apartment and started working in a local electrical company. Time passed. Andy immersed himself in the work. He worked from morning till night so that he did not have time to think. He meets new people but doesn't make friends with anyone. His life was now flowing in a simple rhythm: work, home, and silence. One day, while Andy was sitting in a local cafe drinking his coffee, he saw a woman named Sheila. She was working in the cafe, and there was a strange peace on her face. Sheila looked at Andy with a smile and said, "You come here every day but never talk to anyone." Andy gave a slight smile and said, "Yes, maybe I'm new here." It was the first meeting. Slowly, the conversation between Andy and Sheila began to grow. Sheila had an 8-year-old daughter named Megan. Sheila's story was also painful. Her husband had left her. A strange relationship began to form between Andy and Sheila, but Andy's past was still a deep scar on his heart. Every time he laughed when he spent time with Sheila, Claire and April's face would come out in front of him. Andy knew he wasn't ready to fall in love again, but he also realized that Sheila and Megan had brought a ray of hope into his life. Andy slowly found himself becoming a part of Sheila and Megan's life. He would stop at Sheila's cafe every morning before going to work, grab a cup of coffee, and sometimes joke with Megan. Megan loved Andy's calm and sorted nature, and Sheila saw in Andy a partner who could bring back the faith she had lost in her life. But Andy still had hesitation and fear in his mind. He knew that there were still traces of nostalgia on his heart, and he had convinced himself that he did not deserve to be loved again. One evening, as Andy was sitting alone in his small apartment, he received a call on his phone from an unknown number. He reluctantly picked up the call. On the other side was April. His voice was trembling. "Daddy, are you okay?" Andy choked, but he pulled himself up. "I'm all right, son. April said she was with her mother, but she also said she misses her father a lot." "I'm always with you, April," Andy said in a calm voice. "Even though we're far away, you're always in my heart." Andy's heart became heavy after the call. Over the next few weeks, the relationship between Andy and Sheila deepened. Sheila openly tells Andy that she has started liking him, but she also knows that Andy still has old scars in his heart. "Andy, I understand you. I know it's not easy for you to move on, but I want you to know that Megan and I are here for you whenever you are ready to adopt us." Andy listened attentively and nodded. Time passed. Andy busied himself with work, but the little moments spent with Sheila and Megan brought him joy. One day, Sheila invited Andy to dinner. Megan excitedly hugged Andy and said, "Uncle Andy, can you stay with us forever?" After dinner, Sheila and Andy stood on the balcony watching the city lights. Sheila held Andy's hand and said, "You know, Andy, sometimes life gives us a second chance. We just have to recognize it." Andy looked into her eyes, and for the first time he felt that maybe he was ready to fall in love again. But life isn't always simple. One day, while Andy was at work, he got a call. On the other side was Claire. His voice was trepidated. "Andy, April is missing. She has not returned home since last night." Andy's heart skipped a beat. He immediately left his job and headed to the city. Along the way, countless thoughts flashed through Andy's mind. Did anything happen to April? Is he all right? Is it my fault that I left him? He called Sheila and told her the whole thing. Sheila said in a calm voice, "Andy, nothing will happen to him. You just go to him and find him." Andy arrived in town and went to Claire's house. Claire's face was full of fear and anxiety. Tom was also there, but Andy did not even bother to look at him. Claire reported that April had been depressed for the past few weeks and repeatedly felt that her father had abandoned her. Andy teams up with the police to try to find April. He went from place to place, met old friends, and even visited his favorite parks and libraries. Finally, at a small bus stop on the outskirts of town, Andy watched April. She sat alone, her eyes red, and a small diary in her hand. Andy walked slowly towards her and said, "April, son, I'm here." April raised her head and looked at him. There was a mixture of anger, pain, and relief on her face. "Daddy, why did you leave me? Am I not your daughter?" Andy embraced April. His voice was trembling. "Son, I never wanted to leave you. I thought you had abandoned me, but it was my mistake. I should never have left you." The two hugged each other tightly and cried for a long time. A few hours later, Andy calls Claire and tells her that April is safe. Claire burst into tears over the phone. Andy left Claire's house back in April, but this time he promised that he would always be a part of his daughter's life. When Andy was returning, he called Sheila. "I'm coming, Sheila. I'm not going anywhere except you and Megan." There was relief in Sheila's voice. "We're waiting for you, Andy." Andy turned his truck back to the small town where Sheila and Megan were waiting for him. The clouds of darkness in his life were slowly dispersing, and the light of hope was once again showing his way. Andy drove his truck slowly through the small town streets. Returning to Sheila and Megan, many thoughts were rising in his mind. He knew what he did for April was right, but still there was a small corner of guilt left in his mind. As soon as Sheila arrived at the apartment, the door opened and Megan ran to hug her. "Uncle Andy, you're back!" Her innocent voice and twinkling eyes gave a bit of balm to Andy's broken heart. Sheila stood behind her smiling. Andy looked at him and said lightly, "I'm not going anywhere." Over the next few months, Andy began to organize his life. She started a new electrical service company, which gradually became popular in the city. Sheila continued to manage the cafe, and Megan was excelling at school. There was a stagnation in his life, and Andy began to feel like he had accepted the second chance of his life in the right way. One evening, when Andy returned home, he saw Sheila sitting on the balcony looking up at the sky. He had an envelope in his hand. Andy asked softly, "What's wrong? Is everything all right?" Sheila looked at him and said, "This is April's letter. He wrote to me." Andy's hands went cold. He opened the letter slowly. "Dad, I know that everything you did for me was right. I've spoken to my mom and she's apologizing, but I still feel very far away from you. Will you ever come to see me? Will we ever be able to sit down and talk together? I love you so much. Your April." Tears welled up in Andy's eyes. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. Sheila took his hands and said, "You should go, Andy. He needs you." Andy nodded and decided to return to town the very next day. As soon as he got there, he contacted Claire. Claire called him home. As soon as she reached the door, April ran and hugged him. "Dad, I knew you'd come." Andy hugged her tightly and looked into her eyes. "I'm here, son. I'm always there for you." Claire stood inside, her eyes moist. "Thanks, Andy. I know I did a lot wrong with you, but you never stopped loving April." Andy took a deep breath and said, "It's all over, Claire. We both made mistakes, but now we have to be strong for April." That day, Andy and April talked for hours together. They reminisced their old memories and promised each other that they would never let go of contact. When Andy was about to return, April took his hand and said, "Dad, can I ever come to see you and Aunt Sheila?" Andy returned, but this time his heart was lighter. He told everything to Sheila, and she heaved a sigh of relief. There was no longer any incompleteness in his life. Sheila hugged Andy, saying, "You did right. You should be proud." Time passed, and the lives of Andy, Sheila, and Megan began to become happier. April would visit them often, and Sheila had accepted her as part of her family. One day, Andy proposed to Sheila with a beautiful ring. "Sheila, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but you taught me how to live again. Will you be a part of my life forever?" Sheila's eyes lit up. "Yes, Andy. Yes." Their wedding took place in a small garden where Megan was scattering flower petals and stood smiling in an April gown. Claire and Tom weren't invited to the wedding, and Andy didn't care. A few months after the wedding, Sheila gave Andy a piece of good news. "We're going to have another baby in our family." Tears welled up in Andy's eyes. He hugged Sheila and said, "Everything is complete now." Andy had left the past behind. She acknowledged her pain, let go of her anger, and rebuilt her life. He now had a lovely wife, 2 beautiful daughters, and a young guest. A few years later, Andy had transformed his company into the largest electrical service company in the city. April had finished her studies and become a teacher. Megan was topping high school, and Sheila had opened her own bakery. Andy was sitting on the porch of their house, Sheila next to him, and their children playing on the lawn. He looked at Sheila and said, "You know, I always thought my life was ruined. But maybe that was the beginning." Sheila smiled and said, "This was the beginning, Andy. And now the story is complete." The sun was slowly setting. Andy closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had a relaxed smile on his face. He knew that he had finally found his happiness. Andy's life was flowing in a steady rhythm. Her company was flourishing, Sheila was busy with her bakery work, Megan was doing great at school, and April came to visit her often. Andy was feeling for the first time that his life had finally been balanced. However, there was still a corner in his heart which was looking for an answer to an unfinished question buried in the ashes of the past. One evening, Sheila and Andy were sitting on the balcony drinking coffee. The sun had set in the sky and a cool breeze was blowing. Sheila held Andy's hand and said, "Andy, are you happy?" Andy looked at her with a slight smile. "Yes, Sheila, I am happy. Maybe for the first time I feel like I've got everything I needed." Sheila smiled and said, "But still, I sometimes see the emptiness in your eyes." Andy took a deep breath and stared at the lights of the distant streets across the balcony railing. "That void will probably never be fully filled, Sheila, but you and Megan have taught me how to live again. And April. He is a part of my life. I want to live in the moment now." Sheila squeezed his hand lightly. There was an understanding in their eyes, a promise that they would stand by each other. Over the next few months, Andy and Sheila's life became even more comfortable. Andy's business was now so successful that he decided to open a new branch. Megan was topping the school, and she won first prize in the drawing competition. April was now spending more time with Andy and Sheila. One day, Andy spoke with Sheila and said, "I'm thinking we should go somewhere like a family, somewhere where we can all spend some time together." Sheila excitedly said, "That's a brilliant idea, Andy. We can go to a beautiful place. Megan and April will feel good too." They planned to go to a beautiful mountain resort. The four packed their belongings and set out for the journey one morning before the sun came up. On the way, Megan was singing songs in her tiny voice, and April laughed and joined him in singing. Sheila smiled at Andy, as if she was sure that this family would not break up. Andy grabbed Sheila's hand and said, "It's all possible because of you, Sheila." The four enjoyed the beauty of nature as soon as they reached the resort. They walked the hills, had a picnic by the lake, and enjoyed campfires under the open sky at night. During the campfire, Megan hugged her bear Teddy and said, "Uncle Andy, this is the best trip ever." Andy hugged both of them, and his eyes moistened slightly. In the darkness of the night, Sheila and Andy were sitting on a rock on the shore looking at the stars in the sky. Sheila said, "Andy, how beautiful is this life, isn't it? And I think it's all because I let go of my bitterness." After the trip, they returned to their home, but this time there was a stronger bond between them. Everyone felt more connected than ever. April was now spending more time with Andy, and Sheila and Megan's lives had also stabilized. But life doesn't always stand still. One day, Andy received a call from a strange number. There was trepidation in his voice. "Is this Andy Gilmore speaking?" Andy replied, "Yes, who are you?" "Claire has had a serious accident. He has been admitted to the hospital. You should come immediately." Andy's face flushed. Sheila immediately looked at him and asked, "What happened, Andy?" "Something has happened to Claire. I have to go." Sheila put her hand on his shoulder and said, "I'll go with you." Andy stopped her. "No, Sheila. I'll have to do this alone. I'll be back soon." Andy picked up his jacket, took the keys, and walked out the door. The truck's engine started buzzing, and Andy headed to town. On the way, Andy's heart was beating fast. Her mind was full of many thoughts. Would Claire survive? Is it a sign of a new beginning, or is it the new pain of old wounds? As he reached the hospital door, Andy took a deep breath and stepped inside. There was a look of fear anxiety, and a look of hope for answers to some unfinished questions. Andy walked briskly along the hospital corridor towards the emergency room. His heart was beating wildly and his legs were trembling. She tried to calm herself down, but countless thoughts were running through her mind. Would Claire be okay? Is he coming to see her for the last time? Will he be able to talk to her? As soon as he reached the door, he saw that Claire's sister, Liz, was standing there. His eyes were red, and his face looked tired. Liz looked at Andy and said softly, "He's conscious, but the doctors are saying the situation is serious. Look at him, Andy. This may be the last chance." Andy opened the door and stepped inside. Claire was lying on the hospital bed. His skin had turned pale, and the beep-beep sound of machines echoed through the room. There were injury marks on his body. Andy walked up to him with slow steps and sat down in a chair. Claire slowly opened her eyes. His eyes fell on Andy, and a slight smile came to his lips. His voice trembled. "Andy, I knew you would come." Andy took a deep breath and said, "How are you, Claire?" Claire had tears in her eyes. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, Andy, but I want you to know that I never hurt you intentionally. I was just lost." Andy held her hand. "Claire, all this doesn't matter anymore. We can't change what happened. But you can fight now. You can fight for your daughter, April." Claire closed her eyes and tears began to flow down her cheeks. "Andy, my apology on April. Tell him that I love him very much. And Tom, she tried too, but we could never be happier." Andy said softly, "I'll deliver your message by April, Claire, but you can tell him yourself. Just struggle a little more." Claire nodded lightly. Maybe it's too late now." Andy's heart stirred. He knew this moment might be his last. He held Claire's hand more tightly and said, "You've been forgiven, Claire. I have forgiven you." Claire's eyes sparkled slightly, as if a heavy stone had been removed from her heart. After a few moments, his breathing slowed down. The sound of the machines continued to slow down. Andy called the doctors, but they couldn't do anything. "Claire is gone." Andy closed his eyes and took a deep breath. There was a storm of emotions surging inside him. He let go of Claire's cold hands gently and stood up. Liz and the doctor were standing outside. The doctor said in a low voice, "We tried our best, but—" Liz cried and hugged Andy. Andy calmed Liz down and said, "I'll talk to April. It is my duty to tell him all this." The next day, Andy called April. His voice was trembling, but he was trying to stay strong. "April, son, your mother is no more." There was silence on the other side of the phone for a while. Then came the sound of April's sobs. "Dad, I wanted to forgive them. I wanted to tell them that I love them." Andy felt the pain in his voice. "Son, your mother knew you loved him. She told me she wanted to apologize to you, and they said they love you very much." April cried, "Dad, I want to come. I want to come to you." Andy said with a slight smile, "Come on, son. We're waiting for you." The next week, April came to Andy and Sheila. When he stepped on the door of the house, Sheila hugged him. Megan also hugged him with a smile. Andy looked at her and said, "We're all a family now. Your mother is now in our hearts." April wiped away tears and said, "Dad, can I stay here?" Andy walked up to him and said, "This is your home, son. Always was, and always will be." Over the next few months, April gradually adjusted herself to Andy, Sheila, and Megan. Sheila treated him like a friend, and Megan began to see her like her older sister. Andy finally began to heal his old wounds. She forgave Claire, forgot Tom, and fully embraced her new life. One evening, Andy, Sheila, April, and Megan were sitting on the porch outside the house. The sun was setting in the sky, and a slight, cool breeze was blowing. Sheila held Andy's hand and said, "Andy, This is a new beginning for us, and this time everything will be fine." Andy looked at her with a smile and said, "Yes, Sheila, this time everything will be fine." The sun had set completely, but the sun of hope was still shining in Andy's life. The pain of the past was now history, and a new, brighter life lay ahead of him. After April's arrival, the whole atmosphere of Andy's house had changed. Where silence and emptiness had once reigned, there was now laughter, conversation, and a relaxed sense of family. April was slowly coming out of her inner pain and emptiness. Sheila handled her like a friend and guide, while Megan treated her like her older sister. Andy felt for the first time that a new beginning was possible in his life, where old wounds could slowly heal. One day, Andy and April were sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee together. Andy looked at him with a slight smile and said, "What do you think, son?" Andy took a deep breath and placed his hand on her arm. "April, I'm happy, because you're here. Sheila and Megan are with me. But there are some wounds that simply fade away over time, not completely erased. But I am trying," April said with a slight smile. "Dad, I want you to be happy. I'm here with you and I'm not going anywhere." In those moments, Andy felt that a piece of his heart, which had been broken, was now slowly starting to connect. Over the next few months, Andy began to focus on his business. His company was constantly expanding. Sheila's bakery became quite famous locally. Megan was consistently winning prizes in the school's art competition, and April was getting ready to enroll in college. One evening, Sheila and Andy were sitting on the balcony. Sheila said, "Andy, do you ever think we should spend some time far away? Just the four of us." Andy looked at her and said, "That's a great idea. We should take some time out just for ourselves." They planned a trip to a hilly area next week. The two packed together, and soon the four of them set out on a road trip. On the way, Megan was singing songs, peeking out of the window. April was humming softly to her tunes, and Sheila and Andy sitting in the back, smiling. After reaching the resort, they enjoyed there immensely. Picnics by the lake, long walks in the hills, and sitting by the campfire at night telling stories. It was like a fresh start for them. At night, when everyone else was asleep, Andy and Sheila sat on the lake shore talking. Andy held Sheila's hand and said, "You have brought light into my life, Sheila. You taught me to trust and be happy again." Sheila smiled slightly. "Andy, you taught me that a second chance at love can be beautiful. We both have lost a lot, but now we are with each other, and that's the most important thing." A few days later, they returned home, but this time everyone was even closer. Andy and Sheila felt a new depth in their relationship. Megan and April laughed like sisters. But a calm and happy life is often not stable for long. One day, Andy was sitting in his office when he received a call from an unknown number. As soon as he picked up the phone, a stern voice came from the other side. "Andy Gilmore, you think you can run away from the past, but the past always follows you." Andy's face hardened. He said in a calm voice, "Who are you? And what do you want from me?" The voice said with a slight laugh, "Your time for decisions is over, Andy. The game is now in my hands." The phone got disconnected. Andy immediately called Sheila. "Sheila, where are you and Megan?" Sheila said in a worried tone, "We're in the bakery, Andy. Is everything all right?" Andy took a deep breath and said, "You two go home right away. I'm coming home too." Andy started his car and hurried home. His heart was beating fast. He knew that the danger was not light. It was something of the past that he had left behind, but he was now back at her doorstep. When he got home, Andy found the door slightly open. His steps froze. There was a tall man standing in the living room. A knife flashed in his hand, and April sat frightened on the sofa. Andy stepped in and said in a stern voice, "Who are you? And what are you doing in my house?" The man said with a slight laugh, "You have some incomplete accounts of your past, Andy." The sound of police sirens was heard outside. Sheila must have noticed something suspicious and called the police. The man panicked and jumped out of the window and disappeared into the darkness. Andy hugged April and said, "It's all right now, son. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Sheila and Megan arrived home shortly. Sheila hugged April. Andy made the three of them sit next to him and said, "This danger is not over, but I promise I will protect you all." Sheila held Andy's hand and said, "We are with you, Andy. We will all face it together." There was a sense of strength between them, but the question kept popping up in Andy's heart. What was this danger associated with? Andy's mind was constantly repeating the stranger's voice and his words. "You have some incomplete accounts of your past." The sense of danger did not allow him to rest. He stood on the balcony and stared at the distant sky. Sheila came up to him and put his hand on his shoulder. "You shouldn't be spending the whole night awake like this, Andy. We have to find a solution together," Sheila said worriedly. Andy took a deep breath and looked at her. "I know, Sheila. But I have to understand who it is and what it is all connected to. I can't put you and your children in danger at any cost." The next day, Andy contacted some old friends who were working in the police department. He sent them the details and photograph of the suspect. After a while, a friend replied, "Andy, this guy could be associated with an underground gang. These people are often involved in cases of debt or fraud. But right now, we do not have any concrete information." Andy hung up the phone and thought. His mind was constantly spinning with Tom and Claire the past days. Andy began to dig through old records and files. She pulled out a list of Tom's business partner and their previous contacts. After a brief search, he found a name: Rick Bradford. The name sounded somewhat familiar. Rick was an old business associate of Tom's who was fired by Tom a few years earlier due to some dispute. Andy's suspicion was deepening. Is this the same man who is now targeting her family? That night, Andy told Sheila everything. "Sheila, this guy is probably related to Tom, but I can't tell the police anything without making sure of that. I'll have to meet him myself." Sheila looked at him and said, "Andy, this is very dangerous. Don't go alone. We should tell the police the whole thing." Andy held Sheila's hand and said, "I have to do this, for your safety and that of the children." The next day, Andy locates Rick Bradford and visits him in an old deserted warehouse. The place was deserted and scary. Rick was sitting in his chair smoking a cigar in the dim light. Andy stood in front of him. "Rick Bradford," said Andy sternly. Rick said with a light laugh, "Andy Gilmore, I heard you're a brave man. But I didn't think you'd come here." Andy angrily said, "Why are you threatening my family?" "What do you have to do with me or Tom?" said Rick, smoking out a cigar. "You think it's just a matter between you and Tom? No, Andy. This was when Tom cheated on me. Your wife Claire was also involved in this game. You were just a pawn." Both anger and disbelief emerged on Andy's face. "You're lying. Claire had nothing to do with it." Rick laughed and said, "You think your wife was innocent? She knew what Tom was going to do to me, but she never told you the truth." Andy's heart started beating fast. His mind was not ready to accept this new truth. At the same time, Rick pulled out a pistol from his jacket and pointed it at Andy. "Now the game is over, Andy. You and your family need to be taught a lesson." But Andy was already ready. He picked up a chair lying nearby and threw it towards Rick. As Rick was distracted, Andy snatched the pistol from his hand and dropped it to the ground. Andy pointed a pistol and said, "If you try to get close to my family, I'll kill you." Rick said timidly, "All right, Andy. I'll stay away, but remember, it's not over." Andy tossed the pistol aside and hurried out of the warehouse. His breathing was rapid and his mind was spinning fast. On the way home, he called Sheila. "Sheila, I'm coming home. Take care of the children." When Andy arrived home, Sheila was waiting for him at the door. She hugged Andy as soon as he saw him. "Is everything all right, Andy?" Andy looked into Sheila's eyes and said, "Right now, yes. But this danger is not yet completely over." April and Megan ran up to him and hugged him. Andy held them tight and said, "You two are everything to me. I won't put you in any danger." Sheila grabbed Andy's hand and said, "We're all together, Andy. We will face this threat together." Andy closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew that the danger was not over yet. But this time he was ready. He will keep his family safe at any cost. There were many questions on his mind, but one thing was clear. The battle was far from over. Rick Bradford's words kept echoing in Andy's mind. His past was once again relegated to his present. After returning home, he held Sheila and the children tightly in his arms, as if promising to protect them from every danger. Sheila tried to calm him down, but fear was evident in her eyes. Andy knew that this threat wasn't just a warning, it was the beginning of an approaching storm. The next morning, Andy decided to leave his job and further strengthen the security system. She installed security cameras around the house, installed new locking systems on doors and windows, and alerted neighbors. He ensured their safety as they dropped off Megan and April from school. Sheila closed the bakery temporarily and spent more and more time at home. Andy was keeping an eye on every little activity, but the restlessness in his heart was not diminishing. Later that afternoon, Andy received a call from another unknown number. On the other hand, it was the same cold and harsh voice. "Andy, your precautions won't work. Danger comes from where you least expect it." Andy's face turned white. He said angrily, "Whoever you are, I will find you, and this time I will not spare you." There was a sound of laughter from the other side, and the phone was disconnected. Andy immediately returned home. The atmosphere at home was tense. Sheila and April were sitting in the living room, and Megan was studying in her room. Andy took Sheila to the side and said, "We'll have to shift somewhere else for a while. These people are around our house." Sheila nodded in agreement. They hurriedly packed up some essentials and took the children to an old friend's farmhouse outside town. The farmhouse was in a deserted area but was safe. When April got there, she asked Andy, "Dad, are we going to be here longer?" "I'll fix everything soon." April nodded with a slight smile, but the concern in her eyes was palpable. At night, Andy was standing on the balcony when Sheila came up to him. "Do you think this danger will ever end?" she asked in a low voice. Andy took a deep breath and said, "I don't know, Sheila, but I know that I will keep you and the children safe at any cost." Sheila laid her head on his shoulder, and the two stood silently for a while. The next day, Andy contacted his friend Mark, who was a private investigator. Mark delves deeper into Rick Bradford's background. A few days later, Mark said on the phone, "Andy, I've gathered some important information about Rick. He is still embroiled in some unpaid debts and fraud cases involving Tom, but the most shocking thing is that Tom is still in touch with her." Andy's face turned red with anger. "Tom? It means Tom is still a threat to my family," Andy muttered. Mark said, "Andy, I think you should face Tom. If it all started there, it should end there." Andy took a deep breath and said, "Okay, Mark, I'll meet Tom." Andy tells Sheila to stay at the farmhouse and sets out towards Tom's house himself. When he reached there, he knocked on the door. Tom opened the door and his face turned white when he saw Andy. "Andy, why are you here?" said Tom nervously. Andy grabbed his collar and said, "You know why I'm here." "It's all because of you, Tom. Rick Bradford wants to ruin you, and in his way, I and my family are stuck." Tom redeemed himself and said, "Andy, it's not that easy. I promised Rick some money, but I stuck. I'm trying not to target your family." Andy angrily said, "If anything happened to my family, I wouldn't leave you." Tom stopped Andy and said, "Andy, give me a chance. I'll talk to Rick. I will finish it." Andy looked into his eyes and said, "You only have one chance, Tom. If you betray me, I myself will kill you." Andy returned to the farmhouse. Sheila and the children were waiting for him. He told Sheila everything. Sheila said, "Do you trust Tom?" Andy sighed deeply. "No, but I have no other choice." At night, Andy was lying in bed, but there was no sleep in his eyes. He was repeatedly remembering Tom and Rick's words. He knew that the battle wasn't over yet. Trusting Tom was risky, but perhaps it was the only way to eliminate this threat. Andy watched Sheila and the children sleep. There was peace on his face, but there was a storm in Andy's heart. He must end this fight at any cost. Andy was restless all night. It was not easy for him to trust Tom, but at the moment he had no other choice. He tried his best to make Sheila and the children feel safe at the farmhouse, but the shadow of danger continued to hover over his mind. In the morning, Andy called Mark once again. "Mark, I want you to keep an eye on Tom's every move. If he's lying or involved in any other game, let me know right away." Mark nodded and said, "Andy, I'll keep you updated, but you also have to be careful." On the other hand, Tom called Rick Bradford to meet him in a secluded place. Tom's car stopped in front of an old garage. Rick was already present inside the garage. There was a glint of hatred and cunning in his eyes. "Tom, I thought you wouldn't like to see me anymore," Rick said with a venomous laugh. Tom said in a low voice, "Rick, this has to be over. You leave Andy and his family. I'll pay you back." Rick extinguished his cigarette, saying, "You think it's that easy?" "I don't want your money, Tom. I want your weakness." At the same time, Mark was calling Andy and giving him all the information. "Andy, Tom and Rick just met in a deserted garage. I don't think Tom is trying to save you. He's trying to save himself." Andy immediately started his car and headed to the garage. On the way, he had only one thing on his mind: to keep his family safe. Andy stopped his car outside the garage. There were sounds of Tom and Rick's conversation coming from inside. Andy slowly opened the door and stepped inside. Rick immediately saw him. "Oh, look who's here. Your friend sold you, Andy." Tom said nervously, "No, Andy, I didn't do anything like that. I was just trying to fix everything." Andy looked angrily at Tom. "Your efforts have put my family in danger." Rick pulled out a pistol from his jacket and pointed it at Andy. "It's over, Andy. You played a lot of games. Your time is over now." Before Rick could press the trigger, Andy picked up a nearby tool and hit Rick on the hand. The pistol fell to the ground and Tom quickly kicked it and threw it away. Rick tries to attack Andy, but Andy grabs him and pushes him against the wall. Tom called the police, and within minutes sirens were heard. Rick was arrested by the police. Andy took a deep breath and looked at Tom. "You did the right thing today, but I will never forgive you for what you did. By putting my family in danger, you have destroyed my friendship and trust forever." Tom bowed his head in embarrassment. "Andy, I'm sorry. I'll never get you back, I know." Andy stepped towards his car without saying a word. On the way home, Andy called Sheila and told her everything. There was relief in Sheila's voice, but there was still a shadow of fear. "Is it over, Andy?" she asked in a low voice. Andy took a deep breath and said, "It's over, Sheila. But the scars are still there. We have to put it behind us and move forward." After returning to the farmhouse, Andy hugged Sheila and the children. Megan asked innocently, "Is everything okay now, Daddy?" "It's all right now." Over the next few weeks, things slowly started getting back to normal. Sheila reopened the bakery. April started preparing for college, and Megan regained her old fun at school. Andy began to refocus his company. One evening, Andy and Sheila were sitting on the balcony overlooking the setting sky. Sheila said, "Andy, we've left everything behind, haven't we? We just have to look ahead now. I have lost a lot, but with you and the children, I have found a reason to live again." Sheila said with a slight smile, "We're a family, Andy, and nothing can break us." Andy looked at her. Her eyes relaxed and resolved. This chapter of her life was over, but her story still continued. The night deepened and the stars twinkled in the sky. Andy cradled Sheila in his arms, and for the first time, he felt as if he had emerged from the shadows of the past. She had her family, her love, and most importantly, she had a chance to make a fresh start. Andy finally breathed a sigh of relief. After months of anxiety, fear, and danger, life seemed to be returning to normal. Sheila had taken over the bakery completely, April had enrolled in college, and Megan was chirping in the house with her innocence. Andy's business was booming, and he had no shortage of work. But as much as everything seemed normal, there was still an emptiness in some corner of his heart. One day, Andy asked Sheila to stay back for a while on the way home from work. They both sat in a park. Sheila said with a slight smile, "What's the matter, Andy?" Andy looked at her and took a deep breath and said, "Sheila, I know we've been through a lot, and now we're making a new beginning. But there's still something inside me that I don't quite understand. I feel like something is incomplete." Sheila held his hand and said, "Andy, this is normal. It takes a while to feel completely normal after such a big storm. But here we are, with you." Andy nodded with a slight smile. Over the next few months, Andy further streamlined his routine. He expanded his company, hired some experienced people, and tried to spend more time with his family. But one evening, while he was working in his office, he came across a file, some old information about Claire and Tom. Andy opened the file and saw the papers he had hidden for years, some photographs, some papers, and some evidence that were testimony to the painful decisions of the time. He combated himself and closed the file, but one piece of paper stood in his sight, an old letter from Claire in which he wrote, "Andy, I'm sorry. There is no excuse for what I did, but I loved you. I know I broke your heart, but you must move on." Andy put the paper in his pocket and returned home. Sheila waited for him at the door. "What happened, Andy? You don't look well." Andy said in a low voice, "I remembered some old things. But I don't want to look back now, Sheila. I want to move forward with you and the children." Sheila looked at him and said, "So, let's make a fresh start." A few weeks later, Andy plans a surprise trip for Sheila and the kids. They went to a beautiful resort where the four of them spent time. Megan had a lot of fun playing in the pool. April spent some quiet time with her books, and Sheila and Andy had some happy moments together. One evening, when the sun was setting, Andy and Sheila were strolling along the seashore. Sheila said, "Andy, do you think everything is okay now? But I can definitely say that I am stronger now than ever, and because of you." Sheila looked at him, love in her eyes. "Andy, we've all been through a lot in the past, but now we have a chance to be happy, to be together. We must not let it go." Andy said with a slight smile, "I promise, Sheila, I won't let it go." After returning, Andy perfectly balanced his life between family and business. Sheila's bakery was now the most famous bakery in the city. April finished college and got a job as a teacher in a prestigious school. Megan also surprised everyone with her talent in school. One day, April came home and broke Andy and Sheila with a piece of news. "Dad, I'm going to get married." Andy's eyes were filled with joy and pride. Sheila embraced him. "Congratulations, son." The wedding day arrived. April looked gorgeous in a white gown. Andy led him up the aisle. There were tears in her eyes, but these tears were of joy and pride. April said, "Dad, I love you so much, and I know what you've done for me." "You're my baby, April," Andy said with a slight smile, "and I'm always with you." After the wedding, everyone was having dinner together. Sheila grabbed Andy's hand and said, "Look, we did it all." Andy looked at her and said, "Yes, Sheila, we did it." That night, Andy was standing on the balcony looking up at the sky. Memories of all the wounds of the past came to her mind, but this time they were not making her weak. She told herself, "I had lost everything, but I have gained everything again." Sheila came up to him and took his hand. Both of them silently gazed at the stars in the sky. This chapter of life was now quiet. The shadows of the past were gone, and before them was a new dawn, a new beginning. Andy stood on the balcony and gazed at the city lights. There was a slight chill in the air, and a strange comfort within it. Sheila quietly stood beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. Years of turmoil, pain, and shadows of the past were now slowly fading. Andy took a deep breath and said softly, I feel really free now, Sheila." After April's wedding, there was a new energy in the family. April and her husband had settled down on a new life, and Megan was slowly growing up. Andy and Sheila had started their lives again with a stagnation, but the wounds of the past, no matter how mild they may become, always pinch lightly. One morning, Andy was sitting in his office scrolling through old files. In one of the files, he found an old photograph, Claire, April, and himself, standing on the lawn of their old home. Everyone looked happy in the picture. She looked at the picture and called out to Sheila with a slight smile. Sheila looked at the picture and said, "Haven't you still been able to forgive Claire, Andy?" Andy nodded. "I'm sorry, Sheila. But it may never be possible to forget." Sheila grabbed Andy's hand and said, "That's humanity, Andy. It's hard to forgive, but you did it, and that's what makes you different from the rest." A few months later, Andy and Sheila planned a fresh start. They bought a beautiful piece of land a little away from the city where they wanted to build their own house. Sheila's bakery had now become a successful business, and Andy's electrical company was one of the most reputable companies in the city. He gave shares of the company to his employees and made them shareholders so that the company could run smoothly without him. The construction of the house was completed gradually. The house was on the edge of a calm lake, where the first rays of the sun fell on the water in the morning. Sheila and Andy created a small garden for themselves, where swings and games were arranged for Megan. One evening, Andy was sitting in his lakeside chair. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, and he was admiring the waves of the lake. Sheila came up to him and sat down in the chair and said, "Are you happy now, Andy?" Andy looked at her and said, "Too much, Sheila. I never thought I would be able to feel at peace like this again, but it's all because of you." Megan came running and jumped between them. "Mom, Dad, look what I made." She showed a small painting of a family, Sheila, Andy, Megan, and April. Andy looked at the painting and smiled lightly. "It's gorgeous, son." At night, when Megan had fallen asleep and Sheila had gone to sleep, Andy sat alone on the lakeshore. He recalled all the parts of his life that he had gone through: Claire's betrayal, Tom's plot, Rick Bradford's threat, and finally the solace he found with Sheila. She told herself, "I lost a lot, but I gained more than that." Andy looked up at the sky. The stars were shining, and a light breeze touched his face. It seemed to him that all the shadows of the past had now disappeared forever. The first rays of the sun in the morning fell on the water of the lake. Sheila stood on the balcony and called out to Andy, "Come on, Andy, breakfast is ready." Andy said with a slight smile, "I'm coming, Sheila." Andy got up from his chair and made his way home. He had a relaxed smile on his face. His family, his love, and his future, all was finally at peace.